Welcome to Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and in today's episode, we're opening a file the US government never wanted you to read. A story buried beneath classified ink, whispered in Cold War corridors, and officially denied for decades. It's the operation that smuggled Nazi scientists into America not to face justice, but to build rockets, bombs, and intelligence networks. This is the story of Operation Paperclip. In the final days of World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions were displaced, and the Allied forces stood victorious over the Axis powers. But while the world celebrated the fall of the Third Reich, another war, quieter and more strategic, was already beginning. It was not a war of bullets or bombs, but of minds, secrets, and science. As American, British, and Soviet troops pushed into Nazi Germany from all sides, a new objective began to take shape. Who would claim the intellectual spoils of Hitler's empire? The Nazi war machine had been powered not only by ideology and military strength, but by technological innovation. Their scientists had developed some of the most advanced weaponry of the time: V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, nerve agents, and even prototypes of long-range missiles capable of reaching foreign shores. These breakthroughs terrified the Allies and fascinated them in equal measure. The men who built these technologies weren't ordinary engineers. They were elite minds, many of whom were deeply complicit in the Nazi regime. America, still reeling from the toll of the war and bracing for confrontation with the Soviet Union, saw an opportunity. If they didn't capture these scientists, the Soviets would. And if the Soviets gained access to their knowledge, it could tip the balance of power in the newly emerging Cold War. This urgency, combined with the fog of post-war chaos, created the conditions for Operation Paperclip. Though it wasn't officially authorized under that name until late 1945, the seeds of Operation Paperclip had been planted months earlier. Intelligence officers in the US Army had been tasked with identifying valuable enemy personnel who could aid American military research. These scientists were to be evacuated from Germany, not as prisoners, but as assets. And their backgrounds? Well, those could be cleaned up later. The program was originally overseen by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, IOA, a secretive branch of US military intelligence that operated under the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA. Its mandate was simple: find the scientists, secure their cooperation, and bring them to the United States under false pretenses if necessary. What followed was a morally grey and politically explosive campaign. Many of the scientists recruited had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had worked directly with the SS. Others had designed weapons used to terrorize civilian populations. A few were even implicated in war crimes. And yet, one by one, they were quietly offered new lives in America, complete with paychecks, housing, and in some cases, even new identities. The public, for the most part, remained unaware. The government maintained plausible deniability. Official statements painted the operation as a minor post-war technical exchange. But behind the scenes, a very different picture was unfolding, one in which former enemies became collaborators in the name of national security. Operation Paperclip wasn't just a footnote in post-war history. It was the foundation of America's space race, its missile programs, and many of its early Cold War intelligence strategies. And at the center of it all were men who had once served a fascist regime. At the heart of Operation Paperclip were men whose names would later become synonymous with American scientific achievement, at least publicly. Perhaps the most infamous among them was Wernher von Braun. A brilliant aerospace engineer and a charismatic visionary, von Braun had been the chief architect of the V-2 rocket program under Adolf Hitler. His weapons, hailed as the first long-range guided ballistic missiles, were responsible for the deaths of thousands in London, Antwerp, and other cities across Europe. Even more disturbing, the rockets were assembled by forced labourers from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, many of whom died from overwork, starvation, and abuse. Despite his deep ties to the Nazi regime, von Braun was identified early by American intelligence as a high-value asset. He and his team were swiftly detained and eventually transferred to the United States, where they were offered positions working for the US Army. His expertise in rocketry became invaluable as the Cold War intensified. The Soviets were making strides in missile development, and America was desperate to catch up. Von Braun wasn't the only one. Arthur Rudolph, another key figure in the Nazi rocket program, was brought to the US under similar circumstances. He would go on to become the project director for NASA's Saturn V rocket, the very rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. Yet Rudolph, too, had a dark past. He had overseen operations at Mittelwerk, the underground factory where the V-2 rockets were produced under slave labor conditions. Like von Braun, his Nazi affiliations were sanitized in official documents to facilitate his integration into American society. There was also Hubertus Strughold, known later as the father of space medicine. He conducted experiments on human physiology that were essential to early spaceflight development. But allegations would later surface that linked him to unethical experiments conducted on concentration camp inmates during the war. Strughold denied direct involvement, and while concrete proof remained elusive, the shadow of his past followed him for the rest of his career. These were not isolated cases. In total, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians were relocated to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Many were granted US citizenship, high-ranking positions, and even medals for their service. Some were given new identities to obscure their affiliations with the Nazi Party or their roles in wartime atrocities. The American government in effect traded justice for technological supremacy. To justify these actions, officials often claimed that these scientists were reluctant Nazis, men who joined the party under duress or for professional survival. But declassified documents tell a murkier story. Many had been active party members, some had held SS ranks, others had expressed open support for Hitler's ideology, even late into the war. Yet these facts were either omitted or deliberately altered in their dossiers. The ethical compromises of Operation Paperclip were never put to a public vote. There were no hearings, no trials, no accountability for the atrocities that preceded these scientists' contributions to American progress. Instead, the moral ledger was quietly closed, and the men once branded as enemies became builders of America's future. The justification for Operation Paperclip, according to internal memos and declassified communications, was rooted in pragmatism. Officials argued that if the United States didn't recruit these scientists, the Soviets would. And indeed, the Soviet Union was actively pursuing its own version of Paperclip, capturing German engineers and relocating them to research facilities deep within Russia. The space race, nuclear arms development, and Cold War espionage all intensified the need for scientific supremacy. Morality, it seemed, was a luxury America could no longer afford. The most compelling argument in favor of the operation was simple. It worked. The V-2 technology became the basis for America's Redstone and Jupiter rockets. Wernher von Braun's team laid the groundwork for the US ballistic missile program and later helped NASA leap ahead during the early space race. Without their contributions, the Apollo missions, some argue, might never have succeeded. But this success came at a cost, one that remains the core of the conspiracy. Government agencies went to great lengths to obscure the Nazi pasts of these scientists. Dossiers were sanitized, affiliations erased, and questions redirected. In some cases, intelligence officers were ordered to alter or destroy records that might link these individuals to war crimes or high-level Nazi Party involvement. It wasn't just omission, it was deliberate deception. One of the most notorious examples of this cover-up involves the Nazi scientist Walter Schreiber. Initially brought to the US for his work in medical science, Schreiber was later exposed for his role in human experimentation during the war. Once media reports uncovered his past, he was quietly relocated to South America with CIA assistance, vanishing into the same shadows from which he had been pulled. There are also indications that some officials within the US government opposed Paperclip from the start. Members of the State Department and the War Crimes Office raised ethical concerns, insisting that war criminals should face justice, not be rewarded with prestigious roles in American defense programs. But their protests were largely silenced by higher-ups who viewed the program as a necessary evil in the fight against communism. Documents from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency reveal the cold calculus behind the operation. In one report, an official noted that the benefits outweigh the liabilities in recruiting former Nazis. In other words, as long as these scientists delivered results, their pasts could be forgiven or erased. To the public, these men were introduced as brilliant minds who had been cleansed of ideology. Their Nazi affiliations were dismissed as unfortunate but irrelevant footnotes. In school textbooks, documentaries, and media reports, they became American heroes. Only years later, when classified documents were declassified, did the full scope of their wartime activities come to light. And yet, even with this information now public, much of Operation Paperclip remains shrouded in ambiguity. How many scientists were truly complicit in Nazi atrocities? How many were merely swept up in the regime's machinery? How many truths were buried under layers of bureaucracy and redacted ink? These are the questions that continue to haunt historians and skeptics alike. The claims fueling the Operation Paperclip conspiracy are rooted in a combination of official records, whistleblower accounts, and later declassified government documents. One of the most striking pieces of evidence is the existence of the program itself. For decades, the US government denied that former Nazi scientists were brought to America under covert means. It wasn't until the 1970s, through the efforts of investigative journalists and the Freedom of Information Act, that documents emerged proving what conspiracy theorists had long suspected. Operation Paperclip was not just real. It was extensive, calculated, and deeply secretive. Many of the files released showed a pattern of deliberate deception. In multiple cases, references to a scientist's Nazi party membership or SS affiliations were redacted or revised before submission to immigration authorities. For example, Arthur Rudolph's background was well documented by intelligence officials, yet he was cleared for entry and eventually honored by NASA. It was only in the 1980s, after a renewed investigation, that he was forced to renounce his US citizenship and leave the country. Another example involves Dr. Hubertus Strughold. He was celebrated in American aerospace circles and even inducted into the International Space Hall of Fame. But unearthed documents and testimonies suggested he may have been involved in or aware of medical atrocities during the Nazi era. The evidence was not conclusive enough for prosecution, but the pattern of denial and suppression surrounding his past fueled the belief that his record had been sanitized for convenience. One internal memorandum from 1947, now public, detailed the ethical concerns among some US officials. It acknowledged that many of the scientists being considered for relocation were ardent Nazis and possibly war criminals. Yet the document concludes that no one can argue the value of their intelligence. This quote, frequently cited in conspiracy literature, is seen as an open admission that moral compromise was not just tolerated, it was institutional policy. The program's name itself was part of the obfuscation. Paperclip refers to the way dossiers were marked when potentially problematic information needed to be flagged or removed. Documents that contained politically damaging facts about a recruit's past were often altered or detached from the official record, quite literally clipped and set aside. Perhaps most disturbing is the suggestion that Paperclip was not an isolated exception, but part of a broader pattern. Similar operations, such as Operation Bloodstone and Project Bluebird, show that the US intelligence community was actively recruiting individuals with questionable backgrounds, not just for science, but for espionage, interrogation, and covert psychological operations. This web of overlapping programs creates the sense of a deliberate, coordinated effort to prioritize utility over ethics in the post-war American intelligence machine. For believers in the conspiracy, these facts do more than raise eyebrows. They suggest a system built on lies, one where justice was not only deferred but actively subverted. To them, Operation Paperclip wasn't a reluctant necessity. It was a conscious gamble with the soul of a nation. A deal struck in the dark, with consequences that still echo in the corridors of science, defense, and public trust. While the core evidence supporting the existence and ethical compromises of Operation Paperclip is well documented, the program has long attracted its share of skepticism and rebuttal. Critics of the conspiracy theory argue that many of the claims surrounding Paperclip have been exaggerated misinterpreted or distorted to fit a more sensational narrative. Historians who defend the operation often emphasize the geopolitical urgency of the time. The Cold War wasn't a hypothetical threat. It was an escalating arms race between two global superpowers, each racing toward nuclear dominance and space superiority. The Soviet Union, critics note, was aggressively recruiting German scientists as well, and in some cases removing entire research towns and families to the east. From this viewpoint, the United States was simply acting out of necessity, trying to prevent valuable intelligence from falling into enemy hands. Some experts argue that the majority of scientists brought over under Operation Paperclip were not ideological Nazis, but technocrats, engineers, chemists, physicists, who had little influence over or involvement in Nazi ideology or war crimes. They claim these men joined the party out of social or professional obligation, not devotion, and that in the brutal dictatorship of Nazi Germany, such affiliations were often a survival tactic. In the case of Werner von Braun, defenders point out that while he was a member of the Nazi Party and held an SS rank, there's little evidence that he personally oversaw atrocities. He was, they argue, focused on rocket science, not politics. Similarly, Hubertus Strughold, though his name appears in documents related to Nazi human experiments, was never directly tied to the atrocities themselves, and remained unprosecuted despite extensive post-war investigation. Another counterpoint often raised is the distinction between the operation's existence and the conspiracy around it. That Paperclip happened is no longer debated. What's disputed is the level of ethical compromise involved, and whether the government truly covered up crimes or simply made difficult wartime decisions that, while morally grey, were not illegal or hidden in the way conspiracy theorists suggest. Skeptics also warn of retrospective moral judgment, arguing that applying modern ethics to Cold War decisions ignores the real fear and uncertainty of the era. To them, the idea that the US government made a Faustian bargain is a dramatic oversimplification of a complicated situation in which national survival and scientific advancement were deeply entangled. Moreover, some believe that popular depictions of Operation Paperclip have been influenced by Hollywood dramatizations and online speculation, leading to a mythologized version of the program. They argue that conspiracy culture tends to flatten nuance, presenting all Paperclip scientists as villains and the US government as a shadowy cabal, when in truth the program was messy, fragmented, and governed by conflicting priorities. In the end, while most skeptics concede that Operation Paperclip involved moral ambiguity, they stop short of calling it a conspiracy. To them, it was not a secret scheme to protect Nazis, but a visible, if uncomfortable, strategy in the early days of the Cold War, one shaped by fear, opportunity, and a rapidly changing global order. Operation Paperclip did more than blur ethical lines. It helped redefine the relationship between science, power, and morality in the post-war world. The broader implications of the program stretch far beyond the individuals it brought to US soil. It fundamentally altered how governments justified secrecy, how scientific expertise was valued, and how the public viewed its own national institutions. In the eyes of many, Paperclip symbolized a dangerous precedent. That in the name of national security, virtually anything could be justified. War criminals could be rebranded as geniuses. Evidence could be hidden, rewritten, or destroyed. Public accountability could be replaced with classified memos and quiet relocations. This shift wasn't just about the war, it was about how power functioned in the New World Order. It became a model for future operations, where intelligence value often outweighed legal or moral considerations. The scientists brought over weren't just working in isolated labs. They were woven into the very fabric of American innovation. They helped develop missile systems, satellite technology, nuclear delivery methods, and even early computers. Their research impacted military doctrine, space exploration, and the psychological sciences. And with them came not just knowledge, but influence. Their success helped shape a culture of unquestioned authority around scientific progress, one that sometimes dismissed ethical scrutiny as a distraction from national goals. This dynamic raised critical questions. If former Nazis could be forgiven for what they knew, what did that say about the values America claimed to uphold? Could freedom and democracy coexist with such compromises? These weren't just philosophical concerns. They reverberated through policy decisions, academic circles, and the media for decades. Operation Paperclip also fed into a growing public skepticism toward government transparency. By the 1970s, as the Watergate scandal unraveled and Vietnam protests peaked, Americans were beginning to realize that the government often operated on a need-to-know basis, and the public rarely needed to know. Discovering that Nazi scientists had not only been protected but celebrated deepened the sense that citizens weren't just being misled, they were being manipulated. In educational institutions, the legacy of Paperclip shaped entire fields. Aerospace programs, military engineering, and even psychological research institutions were touched by men whose pasts had been expunged for convenience. This raised uncomfortable realities about the roots of modern scientific advancement. Was the American space program a triumph of democracy or a repurposing of fascist expertise? On a cultural level, Paperclip introduced a layer of distrust that still lingers. It taught a generation that what's presented as truth might be sanitized, that history is sometimes curated, and that heroes can have deeply buried pasts. It invited the possibility that beneath the white lab coats and American flags, there might still be remnants of darker allegiances. In many ways, Operation Paperclip represents the collision point of two worldviews, one of idealism and accountability, and one of expedience and survival. That collision didn't just affect history, it reshaped the trajectory of the modern American state. And the questions it left behind still challenge how we define justice, loyalty, and truth in the face of power. The long shadow of Operation Paperclip extended well beyond the confines of government buildings and classified reports. It embedded itself in the cultural and media narratives of the 20th and 21st centuries. As details about the program began to surface in the 1970s, a wave of documentaries, books, and investigative journalism began to explore the implications of what had once been a closely guarded secret. These stories didn't just recount facts, they shaped public consciousness, adding layers of suspicion to how citizens viewed their own institutions. The program's exposure fed directly into a growing ecosystem of post-Watergate distrust. In a time when the American public was learning about COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and the Pentagon Papers, the revelation that the government had imported and protected Nazi scientists seemed to confirm a chilling pattern. That national security interests regularly trumped ethical considerations, and that the American people were rarely consulted, let alone informed. Operation Paperclip also became fertile ground for cinematic and literary reinterpretation. Films like The Boys from Brazil and series like The X-Files built fictional plots around the idea of Nazi scientists hiding in plain sight, conducting experiments or advancing secret technologies under government protection. These depictions, while dramatized, were rooted in truth. And because reality had already proven stranger than fiction, audiences were primed to believe that what was once labeled conspiracy might be closer to the truth than they had ever imagined. Mainstream media outlets grappled with the duality of the Paperclip scientists' legacies. Newspapers ran stories on the accomplishments of men like Wernher von Braun, praising their roles in NASA's success, even as letters to the editor demanded accountability for their pasts. Television interviews glossed over questions about Nazi affiliations, while alternative press publications dug into government archives and interviewed survivors of concentration camps who had been forced to work on V2 assembly lines. This dissonance between media celebration and grassroots skepticism created a split narrative. To some, the Paperclip scientists were indispensable assets whose work helped win the space race and defend the nation. To others, they were symbols of betrayal, proof that justice had been bartered for power. In more recent years, the internet has reignited public interest in Paperclip, providing a platform for amateur researchers, whistleblowers, and conspiracy theorists to dig into declassified documents and speculate on the full scope of the operation. Digital archives, video essays, and podcasts have made it easier than ever for new generations to learn about the program and to question its hidden dimensions. Even in pop culture today, echoes of Operation Paperclip continue. Marvel's fictional Hydra organization, with its Nazi origins embedded in the US government, directly mirrors real-world anxieties born from the actual program. The idea that evil can be imported, repurposed, and even rewarded under the guise of national defense has become a recurring motif in political thrillers, science fiction, and true crime narratives alike. In the end, the impact of Paperclip on society and media isn't just about what happened, it's about how we remember what happened, and how those memories are shaped, filtered, and sometimes manipulated to fit a more comfortable story. The truth, as always, is more difficult, and often far more disturbing. While the core facts of Operation Paperclip are disturbing enough, the fringe and speculative angles surrounding it offer an even darker, more conspiratorial vision of what may have taken place beneath the surface. These theories push beyond the historical record, suggesting that Paperclip wasn't just a covert scientific recruitment program. It was the beginning of a hidden technological regime, one that may still shape global events from the shadows. One of the most provocative claims is that Paperclip scientists continued secret research into advanced weaponry, psychological manipulation, and even extraterrestrial technology. Proponents of this theory point to the parallel development of classified projects like MKUltra, which focused on mind control, and Project Monarch, a rumoured extension involving trauma-based programming. Some believe that certain Paperclip scientists, particularly those with backgrounds in medicine and psychiatry, were quietly funneled into these programs, contributing to experiments that blurred the line between science and sadism. Another fringe theory posits that some of the technology brought over from Nazi Germany was decades ahead of its time, possibly reverse-engineered from non-human sources. This claim draws from rumours that the Nazis had been experimenting with anti-gravity propulsion and disc-shaped craft, possibly in remote regions like Antarctica. After the war, it's believed by some that US intelligence continued this research in facilities like Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and later Area 51. According to this narrative, Paperclip wasn't just about rockets, it was about acquiring and concealing knowledge far beyond conventional physics. Some conspiracy researchers have also suggested that Paperclip marked the beginning of a Fourth Reich, a continuation of Nazi ideology embedded within Western power structures. According to this theory, certain factions within the American military-industrial complex didn't just absorb Nazi science, they absorbed its worldview. Proponents cite the rise of surveillance technologies, global intelligence networks, and even the use of propaganda techniques as evidence that fascist tools were adopted under democratic banners. The Cold War, in this framing, wasn't just a fight against communism, it was a smokescreen for the quiet repurposing of Nazi tactics. There are also claims that some Paperclip scientists were never fully under US control. Instead, they operated with a kind of protected autonomy, maintaining communication with former allies, influencing foreign policy decisions, and guiding research with agendas that didn't always align with American values. These theories are often linked to unexplained deaths, missing documents, and unusual government behavior surrounding certain defense projects. Perhaps the most speculative idea is that Paperclip wasn't a unique event, but part of a recurring pattern, one where nations, in times of upheaval, seek out morally compromised experts to gain the upper hand, regardless of the cost. Some researchers have tried to connect Paperclip to more recent events, drawing lines, however tenuous, between wartime science, corporate monopolies, and global governance models. While these fringe theories remain controversial and largely unproven, they persist for a reason. Operation Paperclip, by its very nature, demonstrated that powerful governments are willing to bury truth for strategic gain. And once that door is opened, speculation is inevitable. After all, if the world's most powerful democracy could secretly recruit and protect known Nazis, what else might it have done and kept hidden? Operation Paperclip leaves behind a legacy that is both undeniably factual and deeply unsettling. Its story is not just a historical curiosity, it's a blueprint for how power can bend morality and how secrecy can shield uncomfortable truths from public view for decades. As we've traced through this episode, the operation began as a desperate race for scientific superiority at the close of World War II, but what it evolved into was something far more complex. a morally compromised exchange of justice for knowledge, of accountability for strategic dominance. Thousands of German scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers were evaluated by American military officials. More than 1,600 were ultimately brought to the United States. Some of them went on to develop the rockets that launched America's space age. Others contributed to chemical and biological warfare research, nuclear strategy, and psychological operations. Their pasts were erased, altered, or simply ignored, transformed to fit the narrative of American progress. In public, they were presented as brilliant minds helping a free world fight tyranny. In private, many of them had built the tools of terror for the Nazi regime. The American public was never given a voice in this decision. For decades, the very existence of the program was hidden behind redacted documents, classified memos, and bureaucratic silence. And when the truth finally emerged, it wasn't through official channels. It was unearthed by journalists, historians, and survivors who refused to let the story be buried. The operation's consequences stretch far beyond the Cold War. It changed how nations define loyalty. It blurred the boundaries between good and evil in the name of global power. It introduced a precedent, one that said certain crimes could be overlooked if the criminal had enough knowledge to offer. And perhaps most importantly, it taught the world that governments can and will redefine truth when it suits their interests. Even today, remnants of Operation Paperclip ripple through our institutions. The technologies developed, the ethical blind spots normalized, and the public trust eroded. These effects haven't disappeared. If anything, they've evolved, adapted, and embedded themselves in modern systems. In a world where science, warfare, and surveillance continue to advance at breakneck speed, the questions raised by Paperclip remain as relevant as ever. Who gets to decide what information is too dangerous for the public to know? How many layers of secrecy can a democracy tolerate before it becomes something else? And at what point do moral compromises cease to be temporary strategies and become permanent policy? These are not questions that end with Operation Paperclip. They are questions that begin there. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and this has been another episode of Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you would like to support the show, subscribe to Conspiracy Theories and Cover-Ups on Spotify. The link is in the description. Subscribe now.